He was born around 1738 into Yoruba royalty in what is now Nigeria, a child of status, tradition, and future leadership. But history did not allow Thomas Peters to remain a prince. One night, violence shattered his world. He was kidnapped, chained, and forced onto a slave ship bound for the Americas. In a single crossing of the Atlantic, a royal life was erased, replaced by bondage, brutality, and a name given by others. Yet this is not a story about submission. In the plantations of North America, Thomas Peters refused to accept the lie that he was property. He ran, again and again. Each attempt was answered with punishment meant to break his body and his spirit: whippings, branding, iron restraints. Still, he resisted. Where others saw a slave, Peters carried the memory of freedom like a hidden fire. His captors could control his labor, but never his belief that he was born free. Then history cracked open a narrow door. War swept across the colonies. Empires clashed. Promises were made to the enslaved, dangerous promises. Uncertain promises, but promises of freedom nonetheless. Thomas Peters stepped into that moment and made a choice that would change not only his life, but the fate of thousands. What followed was a journey across continents and oceans. From enslaved man to soldier, from soldier to political leader, from abandoned veteran to the architect of a black nation. And yet, for centuries, his name was buried. This is the story of a man who challenged an empire with nothing but courage and conviction. A man who helped found a country and was erased from history for it. If you believe stories like this matter, if you believe forgotten voices deserve to be heard, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we uncover the histories they never wanted you to remember. The fire that Thomas Peters carried within him did not fade with time or suffering. If anything, the years of bondage sharpened it. He watched the world around him carefully, listening to whispers that traveled along plantation roads and riverbanks, whispers of rebellion, of colonies rising against a distant king, of war looming on the horizon. For enslaved people, war was but it was also possibility. When word spread that the British were offering freedom to those who would leave their masters and serve the crown, Peters understood the risk immediately. Escape meant danger at every step. Capture, punishment, even death. But remaining where he was meant something worse: a lifetime without agency, without dignity, without an end. When the moment came, he did not hesitate. Under the cover of confusion and fear as British ships appeared along the Carolina coast, Thomas Peters fled with nothing but resolve. The crossing to British lines was not a clean break from danger, but it was a crossing from certainty into hope. For the first time since his capture in Africa, he stood before armed men not as property, but as someone who could choose allegiance. The oath he swore to the British crown was not born of loyalty to empire. It was born of loyalty to freedom itself. He was assigned to the Black Pioneers, a unit made up of formerly enslaved men who performed the hardest and most dangerous labor of the war. They built roads and fortifications, hauled heavy equipment, buried the dead, and worked under constant threat from enemy fire. It was grueling, unglamorous work, but Peters approached it with discipline and purpose. Every task was a step away from the life he had been forced to endure, and every day served was proof that black men could meet the demands of war with intelligence, courage, and endurance. Peters distinguished himself not through spectacle, but through consistency. He followed orders, protected his fellow soldiers, and showed a calm strength that others noticed. Twice he was wounded during his service, yet each time he returned to duty. Survival alone would have been achievement enough, but Peters aimed higher. He learned how military systems functioned, how authority was exercised, and how promises were recorded and enforced. These lessons, absorbed quietly in camps and work details, would later become weapons far more powerful than any rifle. By the time the war drew to a close, Thomas Peters had risen to the rank of sergeant, a position that carried responsibility and respect. He was issued formal documentation recognizing his freedom paper, proof that his service had transformed his legal status. To many, this certificate represented an ending, the conclusion of a brutal chapter. To Peters, it marked a beginning. Freedom on paper was only meaningful if it could be lived in reality, and he understood that survival after war would require more than gratitude from those in power. As British forces prepared to evacuate black Loyalists from the newly independent United States, Peters stood at a threshold shaped by sacrifice and expectation. He had fought, bled, and labored under the promise that freedom would be honored. He believed, not naively but deliberately, that service must carry consequence. The same resolve that had driven him to flee enslavement now guided him forward into an uncertain future, one where he would no longer fight with tools and timber, but with words, leadership, and an unyielding demand for justice. When the war ended, Thomas Peters stood among thousands who believed they had finally earned a future. The British defeat in the American colonies did not feel like loss to the black Loyalists. It felt like transition. They had served faithfully, endured danger, and carried the burden of a conflict that was never truly theirs, trusting that sacrifice would be met with protection. Ships were prepared, names were recorded, and promises were repeated with official certainty. They would be taken north, away from the former colonies, to a place where land and opportunity awaited them as free people under British rule. Nova Scotia was supposed to be that place. The journey itself was a trial. Winter seas battered overcrowded vessels, delays stretched into months, and illness followed them across the water. Yet hope held. When Peters finally stepped onto the cold shoreline, he carried documents declaring his freedom and years of service. He believed those papers mattered. He believed the empire that had demanded loyalty would now honor it. Reality settled in quickly. The land was harsh, the climate unforgiving, and the settlements poorly planned. Black Loyalists were assigned rocky ground far from established towns, often without tools, shelter, or adequate food. The promised land grants either never arrived or were reduced to small plots unsuitable for farming, while white Loyalists received assistance, supplies, and favorable locations. Black families were left to build lives on the margins, scraping survival from frozen soil and uncertain waters. Winter exposed the cruelty of broken promises. Rations ran out long before the season ended. Children grew weak from hunger, and families burned whatever they could find to keep warm. Some were forced to take exhausting labor assignments simply to receive food, even though they were veterans who had worn the same uniform as other soldiers. Peters watched men who had once stood under fire now breaking stones on frozen roads, not as a path to opportunity, but as a condition for survival. The discrimination was not subtle. Black Loyalists were treated as expendable labor rather than settlers with rights. They were denied fair access to land, excluded from political participation, and often ignored by officials who had once praised their service. Peters, who had learned during the war how authority functioned, recognized the pattern immediately. The problem was not chaos. It was neglect reinforced by prejudice. Promises were being quietly rewritten, their meaning reduced until they no longer applied. Starvation bred desperation. Some families were pushed so far that they considered returning south, trading one form of hardship for another. Others sold years of labor for food, slipping into conditions barely distinguishable from what they had escaped. Each decision weighed heavily on Peters, who felt personally responsible for the men and women who looked to him as a leader. He had not guided them through war only to watch them be abandoned in peace. Rather than accept silence, Peters began to act. He spoke, organized, and documented everything. He understood that memory and record were power, and that without them, Suffering could be denied. As weeks turned into years, his frustration hardened into purpose. Nova Scotia had revealed a truth he could no longer ignore. Freedom offered without equality was fragile, and promises without enforcement were simply another form of control. In the cold settlements of the North, Thomas Peters began the transformation that would define the rest of his life. No longer only a survivor or a soldier, he became something far more dangerous to injustice, a man determined to hold an empire to its word. The hardships of Nova Scotia did not silence Thomas Peters. They refined him, where hunger and cold broke many spirits. They sharpened his sense of injustice and clarified his role within the community. He had seen power up close during the war, had learned how systems responded when pressure was applied correctly, and he understood that survival now depended not on endurance alone, but on organized resistance. Peters did not raise his voice in anger at first. He raised it in reason. Men and women began coming to him quietly, sharing stories that echoed one another with painful consistency. Land promised but never delivered. Rations reduced without explanation. Labor demanded in exchange for basic necessities. Peters listened carefully. He knew that isolated suffering could be dismissed, but collective testimony could not. Drawing on his literacy and discipline, he helped transform private grievances into formal petitions, written carefully and respectfully, addressed to those who claimed authority over their lives. These petitions were not emotional pleas. They were precise accusations. Peters documented service records, cited proclamations made during the war, and reminded officials that black Loyalists had fulfilled every obligation asked of them. They had fought, labored, and sworn allegiance under the same terms as others. What they now demanded was not charity, but recognition of promises already made. Each signature added weight, turning scattered voices into a single, undeniable presence. Colonial officials responded with polite language and little action. Meetings were delayed, decisions postponed, and responsibility quietly shifted from one office to another. Peters recognized the tactic. Delay was not a failure of governance. It was a strategy, and so he escalated, not with violence or disorder, but with persistence. When written appeals went unanswered, he appeared in person. When meetings produced vague assurances, he returned with revised petitions, sharper in language and firmer in tone. His leadership unsettled those in power. Peters was not easily dismissed as ignorant or unruly. He was a war veteran, a sergeant, a man who understood hierarchy and procedure. He spoke the language of loyalty while exposing betrayal, and that combination made him difficult to silence. Officials who once ignored black settlers now found themselves confronted by a man who demanded to be heard and refused to accept symbolic gestures as solutions. Within the black Loyalist communities, Peters' role grew quietly but decisively. He became a point of coordination, someone who translated frustration into action without letting despair take control. He encouraged unity, warning that division would only make their cause easier to dismiss. Even as conditions worsened, he urged his people not to abandon their claim to dignity. Leaving would mean surrendering the truth of what had been promised and broken. Yet each rejection hardened his resolve. The more clearly the colonial system revealed its unwillingness to deliver equality, the more Peters understood that the problem extended beyond Nova Scotia. This was not a local failure. It was an imperial one. The guarantees made during wartime had come from the highest authority, and if justice was to be found, it would not come from minor officials protecting their own convenience. Peters began to speak openly of accountability, not rebellion, but responsibility. He framed their struggle as a test of British honor itself, arguing that an empire could not claim moral authority while abandoning those who had defended it. These words circulated through black settlements, carried from meeting to meeting, building a shared understanding that their suffering was neither accidental nor deserved. By the time Peters stood before his community and proposed a bold new step, he was no longer simply a spokesman. He had become the embodiment of their collective will. The petitions, the meetings, the unanswered appeals had all led to a single realization. If justice would not come to them, they would have to carry their cause directly to the center of power. And Thomas Peters was prepared to be the one to do it. By 1790, the path before Thomas Peters had narrowed to a single, dangerous choice. Years of petitions, meetings, and carefully worded appeals in Nova Scotia had produced nothing but delay and quiet dismissal. Hunger persisted, land remained out of reach, and equality existed only in speeches that were never followed by action. Peters understood what many around him were beginning to fear but had not yet said aloud. The colonial authorities had no intention of honoring their commitments unless they were forced to confront the consequences of their failure. What followed was not an impulsive act, but a collective decision shaped by desperation and trust. More than 200 black families formally authorized Peters to speak on their behalf, entrusting him with their grievances, their hopes, and their last remaining faith in justice. This was no symbolic gesture. By deputizing him, they placed their future in the hands of a single man, knowing that if he failed, there would be no further appeals to make. Peters accepted the responsibility without ceremony, fully aware that the journey ahead offered no guarantee of success or even survival. He left behind his family, his community, and the fragile stability they had managed to build. There were no escorts, no official funding, no protection beyond the authority of the truth he carried with him. The Atlantic crossing was long and unforgiving, marked by uncertainty and solitude. Each day at sea reinforced the weight of what he carried, not in luggage, but in memory faces of children weakened by hunger, veterans reduced to laborers, promises spoken and quietly withdrawn. Peters knew that once he reached London, there would be no margin for hesitation. He would have to confront power directly, on its own terms. London was vast, impersonal, and indifferent to the struggles of distant colonies. Peters arrived not as a curiosity, but as an inconvenience, a reminder of obligations many preferred to forget. Yet he refused to be invisible. He sought out abolitionists, reformers, and officials who might listen, presenting his case with clarity and restraint. His petitions were direct and uncompromising, detailing the service of black loyalists during the war and the systematic denial of land, protection, and rights afterward. He did not exaggerate. He did not plead. He documented. What set Peters apart was his insistence on accountability. He framed the betrayal of black loyalists not as an administrative failure, but as a moral one. The British government, he argued, had bound itself by its own declarations. Freedom had been offered as a contract, and that contract had been honored by those who fought under it. To abandon them now was not only unjust, but dishonorable. These were not the words officials expected to hear from a former enslaved man, and that dissonance made them difficult to ignore. Peters' presence unsettled the comfortable distance between empire and consequence. He was living proof that imperial decisions echoed far beyond Parliament walls. Meetings led to further meetings. Conversations spread, and his petitions circulated among those already questioning Britain's role in slavery and colonial rule. Though he held no official rank, Peters forced himself into spaces where decisions were shaped, using persistence rather than privilege to remain there. He also made clear that the black loyalists were not bound to suffer indefinitely. If Britain could not provide land and equality within its existing colonies, they were prepared to go elsewhere as free subjects. This was not a threat, but a declaration of agency, and it reframed the discussion entirely. The empire was no longer deciding the fate of passive dependence. It was responding to a people prepared to act. By the time Thomas Peters had finished presenting his case, he had achieved something rare and dangerous. He had exposed a betrayal that could no longer be dismissed as rumor or inconvenience. He had transformed neglect into a matter of public record. And though the outcome was still uncertain, one truth had become unavoidable. The Black Loyalists had not been forgotten by chance. They had been ignored by choice. Peters had come to London to make that choice visible. And he would not leave until it was answered. Thomas Peters did not arrive in London seeking escape for himself alone. What he carried into meeting rooms and private conversations was a vision shaped by betrayal, endurance, and an unbroken belief that freedom had to be anchored to land and self-determination. As his petitions circulated among abolitionists and reform-minded officials, something began to shift. Peters' words gave structure to an idea already forming at the edges of British debate, that Black Loyalists deserve not charity, but a place where their freedom could be lived without constant negotiation. From those discussions emerged a proposal that would change history. Britain would support the creation of a settlement on the West African coast, a place where formerly enslaved people could live as free subjects, farm their own land, and govern their own communities. For Peters, the idea carried a deeper meaning than policy or logistics. It represented return, not to a personal past he could reclaim, but to a continent that symbolized dignity and possibility after generations of displacement. Peters became a crucial bridge between imperial planning and lived experience. He insisted that the new settlement must not repeat the failures of Nova Scotia. Land ownership had to be guaranteed. Rights could not be postponed. Freedom could not exist only on paper. His influence shaped how the project was presented to Black Loyalists, but as opportunity. When word reached Nova Scotia, it spread quickly through churches, kitchens, and gathering places, carried by voices wary of winter and neglect. For many families, the decision was painful. Nova Scotia had taken years of labor, loss, and endurance. Children had been born there. Graves marked the land. Yet Peters' message was clear and steady. Staying meant continuing to fight a system that had already shown its limits. Leaving offered a chance, however uncertain, to begin again on terms that had been denied to them elsewhere. Slowly, then all at once, hundreds stepped forward. By early 1792, nearly 1,200 Black Loyalists prepared to leave North America behind. Ships were organized, supplies gathered, names recorded once again, this time not as refugees, but as settlers. Peters returned among them not as a distant advocate, but as a fellow traveler, sharing the risks of the journey he had helped make possible. The Atlantic crossing was long and unforgiving, marked by illness, storms, and loss. Not all who departed would arrive, yet even in hardship, there was a sense that this voyage carried purpose rather than abandonment. When the ships finally anchored off the West African coast, the moment was overwhelming. For Peters, it was the first time in decades that his feet touched African soil. The land was unfamiliar yet resonant, heavy with heat, sound, and color so different from the frozen settlements they had left behind. For many, it felt like the closing of a circle history had violently broken. They named their settlement Freetown, not as a symbol of perfection, but as a declaration of intent. The work began immediately. Trees were cleared, shelters built, and the foundations of a new community laid by hands that had known bondage and war. The early days were difficult, shaped by disease, supply shortages, and the inevitable tension between promise and reality. Yet there was something new in the air, a sense that struggle here belonged to them, not to an empire that could withdraw its support at will. Freetown was not simply a place on a map. It was proof of concept. It demonstrated that Black Loyalists were not dependent remnants of war, but a people capable of building, organizing, and imagining a future beyond survival. Though British oversight remained and conflicts would follow, The act of founding the settlement itself stood as a quiet rebuke to every broken promise that had preceded it. Through persistence rather than power, Thomas Peters had helped turn neglect into movement and despair into migration. Nearly 1,200 lives crossed an ocean because one man refused to accept that freedom could exist without land, voice, and belonging. Freetown stood as the physical expression of that refusal, a city born not from conquest, but from the determination of those history had tried and failed to discard. Despite helping give birth to a nation, Thomas Peters did not live to see his dream fulfilled. In the months following the founding of Freetown, the familiar pattern returned: authority concentrated in colonial hands, promises softened by delay, and voices like his treated as inconvenient. Peters, who had once stood before ministers in London with confidence and clarity, now found himself marginalized in the very settlement he had helped bring into existence. When he spoke out for land rights and equal treatment, colonial officials responded not with dialogue, but with humiliation. His leadership, once necessary, was suddenly framed as defiance. Illness soon followed. The climate was unforgiving, disease spread quickly, and medical care was scarce. Weakened by years of struggle, travel, and disappointment, Thomas Peters died in 1792 at just 54 years old. There was no grand ceremony, no official recognition, no acknowledgement from the empire he had served with such determination. He died, dismissed by those in power, far from the royal homeland of his birth and the justice he had pursued across oceans. And then, for a long time, he disappeared. In North America, history moved on without him. Textbooks celebrated generals and governors while ignoring the black man who had organized thousands, challenged imperial authority, and forced the British government to confront its own contradictions. For generations, his name survived only in fragments preserved quietly in Sierra Leone, whispered in community memory, absent from the official story. It would take more than 2 centuries before Canada formally acknowledged Thomas Peters as a figure of national historic significance, a recognition long overdue and quietly insufficient. Yet erasure did not defeat him. Today, in Sierra, Thomas Peters is remembered as a founding father. His legacy lives not in monuments alone, but in the very existence of Freetown, a city born from refusal, resilience, and the belief that freedom must be claimed, not waited. His life reminds us that history is not only shaped by those who rule, but by those who insist on being counted. Peters did not wield an empire. He confronted one. He did not inherit power. He demanded accountability. And even when denied honor in life, his impact outlived those who tried to silence him. Thomas Peters' story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Whose contributions are remembered, and whose are forgotten? How many architects of freedom were written out because their courage challenged the official narrative? By learning his name, by telling his story, we do more than correct the record. We restore dignity to those who were never meant to be remembered. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If this journey moved you, challenged you, or taught you something history left out, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps ensure that stories like Thomas Peters are no longer erased, but finally given the place they deserve.